Right, we're going to get going. Thank you all for coming today. We are honored to have the Reverend Dr. Gary Mason with us today from Belfast. Thank you for being here, Gary. It's a pleasure, and it's a pleasure to see you live and in person for a while. That said, some of our audience is watching online, so we look forward to having a good discussion. Let me just briefly say, Gary Mason is the founder and director of Rethinking Conflict, which was founded in 2015. The organization seeks to model the principles of the historic Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. It delivers this through building peace and reconciliation at the sharper, more fractured edges of society. Right now, it specializes in three areas of conflict transformation: the Irish peace process, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and here in the United States. Dr. Mason is a Methodist minister. He holds a PhD in psychology from the University of Ulster and completed his theological studies at Queen's University. He is a senior research fellow at the Kennedy Institute for Conflict Intervention at Maynooth University in Ireland and an adjunct professor at Emory University in Atlanta. He's also a faculty advisor to the Negotiation Strategy Institute, which is a Harvard University program for leaders in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Prior to founding Rethinking Conflict, Gary spent 28 years as a clergy person in Belfast, and he was deeply involved in the Northern Irish peace process. He has and continues to be a close advisor to Protestant ex-combatants on the civilianization efforts of paramilitaries. He has worked with both Republican and Loyalist communities in peace building and reconciliation. He has facilitated dialogue between these groups on numerous occasions. I'd also just say Gary is just a pioneer in the field of conflict transformation. We're honored to have him. We look forward to working with him in a formal capacity at UCF. And with my great honor, here is Gary Mason. Thank you very much, Gary.
Hey, good morning, everyone. It's nice to be with you. I normally like moving about, but because this is on Zoom, I have to stay pretty like a statue, I guess, in front of this. David, look, thank you for your welcome. I think the last time I was in campus here was probably 2019, and my wife Joyce and I, who work together in this organization, we were here last March when the United States began to close down. We were literally, I was just about to begin a dialogue tour with an African-American colleague on the legacy of racism and slavery and sectarianism in our context. When the Trump administration, I think on the Friday the 14th, decided to close this space down to Europeans. So we hastily got out of here on the 16th of March and arrived in a quiet Dublin on St. Patrick's Day. And we've literally been home ever since. So this is our first visit back to the United States. I guess that we were having this conversation 30 years ago, early 90s. There were probably three main conflicts that were bubbling about on planet Earth, namely the South African conflict. I'm just going to grab my glasses. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and also the Northern Irish conflict. Wisdom of the day primarily said that it seemed that South Africa was more or less over the line as regards dismantling apartheid. With the Oslo Accords, many felt the possibility that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict could be coming to an end. And the wisdom of the day generally was that the Irish conflict seemed intractable. Winston Churchill, who's affectionately known as the British Bulldog, said as much as that. He said the Irish conflict seems pretty unresolvable. Margaret Thatcher, who was known, as we know, as the Iron Lady, also said exactly the same. And in the period of the conflict that I lived through, that was from 1969 to 1998, I remind people Northern Ireland is a very, very tiny space. North, south, east, west, 2 hours, 2 hours. It's a small space. And during the conflict, we had, in that tiny space, we had 47,000 injuries, 36,000 shootings, 22,000 armed robberies, 30,000 people went through our penal system, with 16,000 bombings and almost 4,000 deaths. It seems minimalistic until you kind of transpose those figures into the United States. So very simply put, if the Northern Irish conflict had happened in the United States over a period of 30 years, you would have had 700,000 dead, 6 million political prisoners, 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, and 3 million bombings. So really suffice to say, when I spent my time back on the island of Ireland, the biggest issue I primarily deal with is the legacy of the conflict. I mean, it's interestingly, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, Senator George Mitchell, who was the Democratic senator from Maine, who chaired the talks leading up to that momentous agreement. On that day, he said, if you think getting this agreement was difficult, implementing it will be even more difficult. And so 23 years after the signing of that agreement, it's still a very fragile peace process. One of the more successful of the last 50 to 70 years, but it's still a very fragile peace process. So what I want to do for a few moments, I'm guessing, David, around about 30, 35 minutes, is that okay, just to keep me right time-wise? It's just to kind of scratch the surface a bit, and then we'll open it up for a wider discussion. I'm going to flip most of these points up, and at least we'll have them where we are. Right there. People often ask the question, there seems to be a lot of layers within this Irish theatre. Political context, social, economic inequalities. Today, as we look at Northern Ireland, when the conflict began way back in 1969, there was a majority then of almost 2/3 Protestant, who saw themselves as distinctly British. The political phrase is the word unionist or loyalist, which just simply means loyal to the Union of the United Kingdom or loyal to the British Crown. About 1/3 Catholic, who saw themselves as distinctly Irish. Political titles would be nationalist or Republican. And primarily when Northern Ireland was created in 1921, would not have wanted that to happen. They wanted to see Ireland really as one nation. So the actual political dispute means that even elections today are still dominated by the constitutional issue. So as we spill towards another local election in May 2022, it's the constitutional issue drives most theatres within our space. Supersedes things like pandemics, supersedes economics. So the constitutional question within our politics is still well up that pecking order. People often ask about the history of the island, and we could go back today to the 12th century, which we're obviously not going to do. But one of the key concepts is the actual proximity between the two islands. And also, in addition to the political and military history, there are many exchanges on equal people, language, culture, goods, technologies, ideas, and language. The 16th, 17th century was crucial in a sense that the northern part of the island of Ireland began to be settled or planted by primarily Scottish Presbyterians, bringing with them very much theologically what you would call a Calvinistic theology, which involves a land theology, almost this vision that God gave us the land. I mean, those of you who grew up in the United States know the first wave of settlers who came here came very much with that land mentality. And it's interesting, if we get on to it today, the whole debate today around Christian nationalism and white supremacy. Some of them believe in this land theology. This land was given to us by God, not dissimilar to some of the concepts within the Israeli-Palestinian theatre, that this land has divinely been given to us by God. So that land theology, very much in the 16th and 17th century, meant that primarily Scottish Calvinistic Presbyterians spilling into the northeastern part of the island of Ireland were moving Irish Catholics off their land, not necessarily a genocide, but moving them off their land and taking the better land. So literally from then right up until 1969, more or less every 25 to 30 years, there was some form of rebellion. So that island has never really been an island. It was actually at peace with itself. 1912 was an interesting year because the British Parliament in London attempted to pass what they call the third, and I say the third Home Rule Bill. Primarily GB, namely Scotland, Wales, and England, wanted rid of that troublesome island of Ireland. But the Unionist population in the northeast cherished their Britishness. And so when the third Home Rule Bill was going through Parliament, on the British Unionist Protestant side, a militia army was raised of about 100,000 men. Now think of the enigma of that. Who do they fight? Do you fight the British to remain British? And on the Catholic side, Redmond's army also brought about 100,000 men. So you're poised here in 1913, two heavily armed groups of 100,000 men about to go to war against each other in the island of Ireland. And the First World War breaks out. And the British cleverly enlisted those 100,000 men on the Protestant side and turned them into the 36th Ulster Division, which was a regiment of the British Army. 80,000 on the Catholic side, who were not necessarily pro-British, also enlisted into the British Army and became the 14th Irish Division. Before that happened, again bringing what I call sort of toxic religion and toxic politics into that theatre. The Ulster Volunteer Force, that were the illegal army on the Protestant British side, many people signed what they called the Ulster Covenant, another biblical word. We think of covenantal theology and Calvinism, think of covenantal theology today as regards the West Bank and Judaism. This land is our land. That Ulster Covenant was signed by over 500,000 people. Some of them signed it in their own blood, absolutely determined to remain British. During the First World War, in Dublin, we had the Easter Rebellion, again, pulling the kind of God is on our side theology, which is not dissimilar to some of the conversations that are happening in the United States at the moment, really basing this rebellion or this uprising on the resurrection of Jesus. As that was victorious, we will be victorious as Irish rebels driving the British out of Ireland. It was an abject failure. But the biggest failure was what the British did, because they executed the 12 leaders of the Easter Rebellion or Easter Uprising, and that brought about a massive ground support for those who spearheaded the rebellion. Eventually, we had an internal civil war, a war of independence in Ireland, and eventually Northern Ireland was formed in 1921. And the rest, the other 26 counties, became the Republic of Ireland. We eventually moved into the recent conflict there that I alluded to. And primarily, this began over civil rights, where Catholics and liberal Protestants also were agitating against the Unionist-dominated government, asking for civil rights for Catholics. Eventually, that began to spill into a conflict. And militia groups, or terrorist groups, or freedom fighters, whatever phraseology you want to use on either side, began to arm themselves. The British Army were eventually stationed in Northern Ireland. And interestingly, most people don't know this, it was the longest British operation in military history. One stage, the British Army had more troops in Northern Ireland than they actually had in Iraq. In 1972, when I was a little boy, there was a terrorist incident every 40 minutes. People very much spilled into their own spaces and stayed in their own spaces. Areas were heavily segregated, and even today, 23 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast is still peppered with very, very high Berlin-type walls. Even after the Good Friday Agreement, a number of these walls have been built. So while our peace process is modelled as pretty successful, it is still a very fragile peace process. Early 1980s were an interesting time in the Irish context. At that time, the IRA and a small political party called Sinn Féin began to agitate for political status for prisoners. And they went on a hunger strike. Remember it well, 10 people starved themselves to death within the Republican side of the fence, agitating for political status for what they deemed as political prisoners. The British government stance was that you're not political prisoners, you're criminals, you're terrorists. But that began to open up, particularly in the mid-1980s, a number of channels. So very simply put, up until then, the IRA's strategy was the long war will eventually drive the Brits out of Ireland. So they were changing some of their theatre in the 70s and in the 80s, not just internal conflict in the island of Ireland, but bombing London, Birmingham, Manchester, other spaces. Very much a kind of economic war. If we try to rip the economic heart out of GB as well, the Brits will eventually leave. But what happened then was the IRA and Sinn Féin developed what they call a twin track approach. It was simply this: the Armalite or the AK-47 in one hand, and the ballot box in the other. And as the late 80s began to evolve more and more and more, a number of key actors within the IRA began to believe that the political strategy was the best way to achieve an agreed Ireland. And around that stage, there were a number of back channels began to open up. I was the youngest clergy person of a small group of clergy who began meeting privately with the IRA. And I described ourselves, I suppose, we were kind of interlocutors. Both the British, Irish, and American administrations were obviously aware of these conversations, but we were really temperature readers, trying to ascertain, was the Republican movement and those on the loyalist side willing to drop the kind of AK-47 strategy and move towards a political strategy. Now, this was not an overnight phenomenon. I often mention to people, as one person put it quite correctly, getting the IRA to go off the stage was like going into the highest building in New York and turning off the lights one switch at a time. And sometimes when people look at negotiations, we always work in the assumption it's doing a deal with your enemy, and that is part of that. But sometimes what I call intergroup consensus, getting your own group over the line, is much more difficult at times than actually doing a deal with your enemy. Eventually, we spilled into ceasefires in 1994, which really gave a breathing space to allow people to begin to have more open and frank conversations. So we had the Downing Street Declaration in 1994. The IRA, or in 1992, the IRA declared their ceasefire in August 1994, and the loyalist groupings followed soon afterwards. And that allowed really a lot more public engagement in relation to the whole concept of building peace. In 1995, Bill Clinton, who was President of the United States, gave Gerry Adams a visa to visit the United States. Figure the significance of that. Here is a person, so Gerry Adams was the spokesperson for Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA. So here is the American president giving a visa to the spokesperson of the most lethal terrorist organization in Western Europe to visit the US. And many challenged Clinton's wisdom on that. But Clinton was being briefed very much by the Irish government, who through back channels believed there was a window, small as it may be, to possibly move the IRA away from armed struggle into a political project. Several months later, telling the story to David last night, Bill Clinton visited Belfast. And he did his keynote address literally in a factory, literally just behind my church, the interface in West Belfast. After leaving that building, Clinton's cavalcade, or the beast as you Americans call that massive vehicle that the president travels in, drove down the Springfield Road, arterial route, turned left into the Falls Road, and coincidentally, in inverted commas, Gerry Adams just happened to be coming out of the morning bakery as Clinton's cavalcade passed. The car stopped, and Clinton got out and publicly shook Adams' hand. So people were saying, what the hell? Why is the president of the most powerful country in the world shaking the hand publicly of a spokesperson for an organization that had been responsible for thousands of deaths? But Clinton was boxing clever, because he knew inside that organization there was a struggle for the soul of the IRA. Do we continue armed struggle in tandem with our political project, or do we ditch armed struggle and move totally towards politics? So what Clinton was really doing was empowering Adams and those within the IRA who wanted to move towards the political struggle to go back to the hard men of the IRA and say, this is what you get when you move to a political route. But still wasn't plain sailing, because on February the 9th, which was my birthday, 1996, I was out for a meal with some friends, and the IRA bombed literally the economic heart out of Canary Wharf in London. The reason being, they said the British were not entering into talks quick enough, they were acting in bad faith, and they were not dismantling their military machine quicker. And that impasse lasted for almost 9 months, until eventually the IRA restored their ceasefire. And it was at that stage that Bill Clinton asked Senator George Mitchell, would he consider chairing the talks leading up to the possibility of a peace deal in Ireland? And the release of the conversation, I know a question naturally always will ask, Senator Mitchell asked President Clinton, do you know how long this will be? Clinton said, I'm guessing 4 months. It was 24 months of long, protracted negotiations to really get us over the line for what was the momentous Good Friday Agreement. Tony Blair had moved into Downing Street in London as the Prime Minister of the Labour Party. Bertie Ahern was Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, in the Irish government of Fianna Fáil. And those two men, I can tell this categorically, I know Bertie Ahern well, we still work together. Bertie spent literally every day, and I mean every day, at some stage of his time as Prime Minister working on the Irish peace process. And the Good Friday Agreement resulted in massive compromise. For example, the Irish constitution had always claimed territorial jurisdiction over Northern Ireland. They saw that this is part of the island of Ireland. Bertie Ahern's leadership had what we called Articles 2 and 3 removed from the Irish constitution. I mean, that was no overnight phenomenon. There's a book even in that in itself. Three main pillars of the Good Friday Agreement were release of prisoners, decommissioning of terrorist weapons, and the reform of policing. The one issue that was left out, and many still talk about this, was the issue of dealing with the past and legacy. And it still haunts us today. It still is not resolved, even today, as I speak, 23 years later. Now, you can interpret this in a number of ways. It was a mistake by those who were the architects behind the agreement. Or if you had put in a very detailed mechanism around legacy, we may never have got the deal over the line in the first place. And obviously, the wisdom of Mitchell and other advisors at that stage was, let's just try to get this over the line. So prisoners were all released over a 2-year period. But these people had a lot of blood on their hands. But people realized, British government, Irish government, American administration, that unless these prisoners were released, they never would have gotten a deal. So Sinn Féin would have never signed up to it, and the smaller loyalist parties who were representing militia groups within the loyalist theatre wouldn't have signed up to it either. The decommissioning of weapons was meant to happen inside 2 years. It took the IRA until 2005 to decommission their weapons. It took the loyalist groupings until 2009. The most lethal loyalist terrorist grouping, the Ulster Volunteer Force, read their weapons decommissioning in my church building. It was a long, protracted project. Policing reform has probably actually been the most successful. And during the conflict, the police was called the Royal Ulster Constabulary, very much a very strong militia force within a government sense, but fighting terrorism on many fronts. That had to change considerably. The vast majority of those in the police were from the Protestant Unionist tradition, and they were targets. They lost 300 officers during the conflict. So that had to be reformed completely, and Chris Patten, who was the former British ambassador to Hong Kong, made 176 recommendations to be implemented. There's no question policing in our space is held up as one of the most successful policing reforms on planet Earth. Interestingly, when our police do spill into a meeting in relation to be it parades or disputes, the first question they're asking, there's very few police forces asking this, how do we protect a person's human rights? So it's not policing the community, the phraseology is policing with the community. So there's very much accountability within that. So there is a policing board for Northern Ireland. The chairperson of my organisation, Debbie Waters, was the former vice chair of the policing board for 6 years. There's also an independent investigating body. So it's not police investigating police. There's an independent body that actually allow them to investigate the police. Today, we're still not at 50-50, but 30% of the PSNI, the police service for Northern Ireland, would be from the Catholic nationalist tradition. So there's no question about that. That has been a very, very successful operation. Just looking at some of those building blocks there for a moment. As I mentioned, putting the Good Friday Agreement and implementing it has been incredibly difficult. Initially, one of the smaller unionist parties, which is now the largest unionist party, the Democratic Unionist Party, didn't buy into the whole Good Friday Agreement. And it was really until 2006, 2007, where they eventually bought into it. The main leader of that party was just a religious fundamentalist on the Protestant side, the Reverend Ian Paisley, eventually became First Minister of Northern Ireland, along with Martin McGuinness, who's a very, very senior figure within the IRA. For many people, they saw that as a sign that things were changing. However, in 2012, we had some major violence on the streets over what were flag protests. Symbolism in our space is incredibly important, and the British flag would have always flown from Belfast City Hall. But Sinn Féin were moving into the majority in the City Hall, and that flag was taken down, only to be flown on 15 to 17 designated days. So for many people in that British tradition, they saw this as neutralizing or minimizing their British identity. So we ended up with 3 months of violence over that. The statement to stop that violence was read at a project I was spearheading at that stage in East Belfast. And then, of course, as we all know, June 2016, we got Brexit. Northern Ireland voted to remain, 56%. Scotland voted to remain. But both England and Wales voted to exit the European Union. People often ask, what was Brexit about? There are many theories. Some people saw it as the rise of English nationalism. Some people saw it as the immigrants are taking our jobs. We need to disengage from Europe because Europe basically had porous borders. So I could have gone to work in Spain, Germany, Poland, France, Portugal, wherever. So many saw this as the rise of English nationalism. The same way the whole debate's going on in your space at the moment about Christian nationalism and white supremacy. The key to the Good Friday Agreement in many ways was blurring identity. So those British Irish identities were incredibly strong. But the Good Friday Agreement allowed you to designate as British, Irish, Northern Irish. You could hold both a British passport and an Irish passport. The whole European identity was strong to many people within the northern part of Ireland. So many people saw Brexit particularly on the nationalist Catholic side and on the liberal unionist side, is actually just shredding their whole European identity. And so Brexit, as we stand today, we have an invisible border down the Irish Sea to do with trade rules and trade laws and regulations and tariffs. So for many people, again, on that British-Irish side, they see this, on the British side, they see this as minimising, again, their British identity. And so with some minor violence on the streets of Belfast and other cities in relation to this. In relation to the possibility of an agreed Ireland, which is the major issue that's driving politics in our space at the moment, the Good Friday Agreement put in what they called the principle of consent. It simply means if a majority in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland vote for the border to be removed between North and South, a united Ireland or an agreed Ireland should follow. Now, although unionism signed up to that, the problem is Brexit, in reality, has pressed the fast forward button. Why do I say that? For many more moderate nationalist Catholics living in Northern Ireland, they saw their Irishness recognised. They saw their national identity recognised. They saw their political goals enshrined within an international agreement. For many of them, Brexit has ripped that carpet literally out from under their feet. So for many moderate nationalists now in the northern part of Ireland, they're trying to press the fast forward button to move towards some form of agreed Ireland. Most of us probably assumed if this ever happened, date-wise, we're talking something like 2040. None of us seen this happening, possibly in the next 5 or 6 years. And so that is sharpened because many people living in that Northern Irish space at the moment were people who were involved in the conflict or suffered in the conflict. The hope basically was, to put it bluntly, that you were going to kind of kick the can down the road for another post-conflict generation to actually deal with this. So it sharpened that whole antagonism on both sides. So just finally, just let me highlight, because I know David alluded there, to this whole concept of global lessons. Over the last 10 years, I've had around about 1,000 Israelis and Palestinians in Belfast and in Dublin. And that's of all shades of opinion. So I'm not just talking those on the left, those on the right. We've had Likud, Shas, Moritz, Labour, Arab Joint List, Jewish Hope. Not saying to them that the Irish peace process, as some people would attempt to say, particularly those who put it together, is a blueprint for the Middle East, but suggesting that there are possible lessons from the Irish peace process that may be applicable to the Middle East. I'm involved in a project at the moment, in New York a few days ago, meeting with some people in relation to it. We're a group of Israelis and Palestinians of a younger generation, primarily in their 30s and 40s, are working along with Harvard, looking at a research, mapping, and engagement. And academics at Harvard have gone through, this number is ludicrous. I didn't even believe it when I read it. I think there was something like 146 conflicts since 1945 to date. And they've picked what they believe are the top 10 that may have applicability to the Israeli-Palestinian theatre. And the Northern Irish one is in there. And I often ask Israelis and Palestinians, having spent a number of days with me in Belfast and also in Dublin, what are the lessons you believe, not what I think, that may be applicable to the Middle East? And I'll just give you those 5 and then we can open up for a conversation. The first thing they say is that political leadership is essential to achieving peace. They seem obvious. But leaders on all sides of the conflict must sincerely believe that change is preferable to the status quo. David and I, over dinner last night, had a long conversation on the status quo in the Israeli-Palestinian theatre at the moment. But they also must be willing to take the risks to achieve peace, while providing a vision that ensures they maintain the confidence of their grassroots supporters. And many critics of Oslo Accords in the early 1990s say that was one of the biggest weaknesses of the Oslo Accords, that there was a kind of elite group that were dealing with this. It was never sold to the general public. The Good Friday Agreement, in many ways, was marketed very heavily by marketing experts. I mean, Clinton come back again to turn the Christmas tree lights on in Belfast. So there's a kind of feel-good factor in leading up to the vote in relation to the Good Friday Agreement. The second lesson Israelis and Palestinians tell me that they learn is there was a desire to break the cycle of violence, to save future generations from the horrors of conflict. What we had really in the early 1990s was what we called a mutually hurting stalemate. So the British Army, Google, if you're bored tonight, the top 10 armies in the world. British, Russians, Chinese, India, Pakistan, French, America, Israel. So here's one of the most effective military machines on planet Earth, able to contain the IRA, no question about that, but never defeat them. The IRA were never going to defeat the British Army, any more than the loyalist groupings were going to defeat the IRA. So we ended up really with what we call this mutually hurting stalemate. But that meant that Republicans and nationalists on the Irish side, Unionists and Loyalists, played a really important role in creating an environment for peace. And that desire for a better future really encouraged leaders to take risks, face down accusations of betrayal from within their own communities to achieve peace. Something that always comes up every single time is Israelis and Palestinians say to me, Gary, you don't understand. I ask, what do I not understand? We don't trust each other. And I remind him, do you really think in those days, the late 80s, when people like myself, a number of others, moved into rooms of people with a hell of a lot of blood in their hands through terrorism, do you think there was trust? There was no trust. I mean, trust only comes in the context of a meaningful relationship, making commitments, building confidence. And the other lesson they learned, which I think is crucial for many folk from the Israeli side, that attempts to resolve our conflict by military force were ultimately futile. You kill one of us, we kill one of you. Kill one of us, we kill one of you. So we really only got real security when we dealt with the root causes of the conflict. That's when we got real security. When people had the courage to deal with the root causes of the conflict. I often say there's three ways of dealing with conflict. Genocide or annihilation. Think Sri Lanka. So military forces crush the Tamil Tigers. There's no signed peace agreement, but there's no one in this room can say to me, Gary, I can guarantee you categorically, never in the next 100 years will the Tamil Tigers ever rise again. If history is anything to go by, the power of memory and the power of story, passed down from generation to generation, there's no guarantee. Second way is containment. You contain the terrorist threat. And the third one is negotiation and settlement. The fifth lesson, and I'd finish with this for all of us in this room, is the role of civic society in building peace. But there's one lesson from the Irish peace process that I often highlight to people is that in many ways, civic society, people in this room, have been the social glue that has held our peace process together. Academics, women's groups, religious leaders, business people. So we've developed this theory called the political peace process versus the social peace process. Politicians assume that once a deal is done, societal healing will automatically follow. Nothing can be further from the truth. Nothing. And that's why civic society needs to be in that space. I mean, our devolved assembly was down there from January 2017 to 2020. And people used to say to me, why have people not gone back to war? I just gave them a very simple answer. Civic society has really been the social glue that holds our peace process together. So for some of you younger folks sitting in this room, you ask me, what can I do? Well, it's a very fractured space at the moment in the United States. You don't need me to remind that. I mean, the irony is, I have colleagues from MySpace, who 25 or 30 years ago wanted to kill each other, doing Zoom calls with me to different spaces in the United States, trying to help Republicans and Democrats disagree well, which may seem like a pipe dream. But I mean, it's like a comedy. It's interesting. I mean, last night I finished with the Carter Center, who I've done work with for 10 years there in Atlanta. For the first time in their history, they're actually doing work internally in the United States because they're so concerned with the fractured relationships in this space politically, where people cannot seem to disagree well. So, David, look, I'll stop there and see where we go from there. Okay.
Thank you very much, Gary. We're going to take some questions from the
Okay.
audience as well as some questions that some people submitted online. So I'll ask the first, and I reserve the right to paraphrase.
Okay, go ahead.
You are a man of faith. You're a minister who was active 28 years. The role of religion is something that actually can be used, obviously in this context, to be something that can help, but it also can be used to harden narratives, particularly in fractured societies. So what is the proper role of religion in this space? And is one religion anymore, are all religions, do they work similarly in this?
Islamic record is saying that, I mean, religion at times can be absolutely toxic. There's no question. What I kind of call theologies of superiority. That my interpretation of sacred texts is more superior to your interpretation. I mean, interesting, I mean, if you look at this space here that we inhabit today, the United States, I think it was the late 15th century, the Catholic Church passed a doctrine which I'd never heard of even in Europe. But doing some work around Christian nationalism and white supremacy, this was called the Doctrine of Discovery. Google it there. Which basically gave white Europeans like me an imprimatur for a genocide of people who were not like me and did not share the Christian faith. I mean, I often, if you look at the Holocaust, primarily what Hitler did was take what in this room we would call religious anti-Semitism and cleverly repackaged it as racial anti-Semitism. So I'm quite happy to say that the church's hands in this are not clean. I mean, the Ulster Volunteer Force, whom I alluded to there, their motto was "For God and Ulster," because they were convinced God was on their side. And it's interesting how we, I think sociologists of another generation said, God made man in his image and we've returned the favor. So basically we have this tendency to make God in our own image. Is he white? Is he European? Is he American? No, he's British. No, perhaps he's South African. Is he Israeli, Palestinian? So we always bring God into our particular side, particularly when we're pursuing balance. So Dave, I'm happy enough to say publicly that there's aspects of religion. And I think you only had to look at the debate around the Capitol building on the 6th of January. You had a cross 10 meters from a gallows. I mean, how do you equate that? I mean, the legacy of slavery in your space, much of it is a theological narrative, where certain people deemed other people of a different skin color to be subhuman. So while it's not playing out like that today, David, I would often argue while the Irish conflict was never a religious war, in a sense. Invariably, when there's conflict, there's three areas: it's land, identity, and religion. But elements of theological superiorities were always bubbling below the surface. That my interpretation of the sacred text is more important, or indeed more correct than yours.
Open it up for questions from the audience.
You mentioned one of the most important ingredients is trust. And so during the negotiations, Jerry Adams was representing Sinn Féin. But was he truly an honest broker? As it relates to, he was supposed to represent Sinn Féin but not be a part of the IRA.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that debate goes, I mean, this is, it's a bit of a, I know Jerry Adams, so it is a bit of a kind of tongue-in-cheek joke back home that Jerry Adams was never in the IRA. I mean, the simple answer to that is in 1972, when the British government met with the IRA, allegedly in secret, but obviously it's still lied, Jerry Adams was part of the negotiation. But, I mean, others have owned up to that. Jerry Adams, for some reason, never has. The IRA would never have gone over the line without the leadership of Adams. And I think the other thing to say as well, I mean, both Adams, Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, took risks with their own lives. Because I mean, we all know in this room how terrorism works. Maybe you kind of fall out of favour or you're seen as being a little bit too weak, invariably it's one in the head and you're dead. So I mean, there was a very, very delicate dance for the leadership of the IRA to actually move their constituency over the line. And they didn't move them all over the line. I mean, there was a small group of maybe 5% ended up forming another 3 small terrorist groupings, which are still functioning today, albeit pretty weak. So, I mean, that's why it was such a long process. And that's why that, I think that illustration, switching off the light switch one at a time, starting at the bottom of the highest building in the US and going up and switching off all those light switches. It takes absolutely ages. Because the key component is you need to bring the vast majority of your people with you, or you end up with another 4 or 5 heavy hitters within that world of political balance. So I mean, it was really a delicate dance. When the UVF moved towards their weapons decommissioning, they had 2 years of what they called roadshows, obviously privately, where their key actors went around all the different brigades and groupings to make sure that when that statement was read out, that everyone was on the same page. So it was a very, very delicate dance, just moving people forward. And we know that in the Middle East today. I mean, the amount of groups, and I mean, for those who are working with a number of those groups, I mean, with Hamas and others, and Hamas have very much modeled themselves in the IRA. I mean, Hamas's strategy, we were having this conversation 25 or 30 years ago, Hamas's strategy was very much, military muscle. We'll achieve what we need to achieve. But now they've done the IRA thing, ballot box in one hand and Armalite in the other. And if they ever move towards politics completely, the key is for that movement to move forward in one block rather than shred off another 4 or 5 movements. I mean, that's a very, very difficult scheme of negotiations to do for anyone who's doing it.
Next question is from online, and we'll go back to the audience, and that is, despite its fragility, the Irish process is considered successful. How likely is a similar agreement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, particularly when there's so many external actors involved?
I think common wisdom at the moment is that within the next 5 to 10 years, there will not be what they would call a whole-scale agreement within the Israeli-Palestinian faith. A number of people are suggesting what they're calling interim measures. In our context, I suppose this happened, David, as you know, in the late 80s, sort of early 90s, confidence-building measures. So trying to build up, or to use Micah Goodman's phrase where he talks about measures that may shrink the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The irony, I suppose, there in many ways as well is that looking at that, if it is, as people say, if you have a one-state solution, then the Israeli project, as many people who see themselves as Zionists, mean that Israel ceases to become a Jewish state. So do you maintain the status quo? I mean, is that the way to do that? And in many Israelis' minds, that is the way to do it. Let's just maintain the status quo. The difficulty with that is, as David has alluded to, it doesn't pencil in the external factors, the uncertainty of other things that could take place in the Middle East. But at the moment, if you were to ask me to make a prediction, I can't see anything happening of any significance, at least in the next 5 years. But I know there are a number of people still working on that, as we all know, this are considerably behind the scenes. The difficulty of your space at the moment with COVID, the Biden administration is not making that a top priority at the moment for a multiplicity of reasons. of what's happening in your own space as well.
Right there, and then, go ahead, you.
Hello, thanks for speaking today very much. I'm Stoic Dan from Orlando, and I organize philosophy discussion groups. And I'm often concerned with what you mentioned in the second half of your presentation about society being fractured in a lot of directions. You know, sometimes the conflict is the line is drawn around religion or land, as you mentioned. But now society seems fractured in a lot of ways, and I'm wondering, how can we improve civil discourse in that multi-fractured situation?
Fred Stevens, the journalist, has this great phrase where he says, to disagree well, you must understand well. And my concern is I look at American society, listen to me, I stay in homes with people who are Republican voters and Democrat voters. I mean, I listen to their stories, I listen to their narrative. And in many ways, they don't seem to understand the other. And I've often said, David, you know, I wonder what the role of academic institutions like yourselves is, and also faith bodies, in bringing, I mean, we use, I suppose, in our context, we use sacred space for a lot of these, what we call uncomfortable conversations. So what is the role of academia? People in this room, what's the role of people, of a mosque, of a synagogue, of a church, in bringing people into these spaces to humanize the other person? In our conflict, of those 30,000 people that went to prison for some dreadful, dreadful things, if they had been born in Orlando, San Francisco, Vancouver, Berlin, Madrid, 90% of them never would have been in prison. Now, that's not justifying what they did. I've spent my life condemning political violence, but I understand why they did it. As a colleague of mine said, you know, Gary, someone in the late 1960s did not fly over Northern Ireland, spray us all with lunatic gas, and we all woke up one morning and said, let's start killing each other. There was a context of centuries of toxic politics and toxic religion. And your space at the moment is not in good shape as regards political discourse. I mean, Jonathan Sachs, the Jewish rabbi who died there 9 months ago of cancer, uses this phrase, linguistic violence. As I look at your space at the moment, as I look at my space over Brexit as well, linguistic violence is very prevalent in the public space. So for groups like yourselves, you're going to have to bring people who fundamentally disagree into the same room. And I know some of the work that the Carter Center is attempting to do is they're trying to bring Republicans and Democrats together to disagree well and then to try to understand well. There's nothing like asking the person with whom you disagree, tell me your life story. Tell me what shaped you. I mean, Goskal, the academic, said that science has proven that storytelling is one of the most effective mechanisms for bringing about change. And the way I illustrate that is quite simple for all of us. Some of us need to go back further than some of you younger guys. But think when you were a kid and you were sitting in your pajamas, and mom, dad, or aunt or uncle come into your bedroom and opened up a book and they said 4 magic words. Once upon a time. So how does America create what I would call once upon a time moments? Why do you think the way you think? And I mean, I've been quite open and honest about this. I mean, if I was doing some work in North Georgia, and I sang to some religious leaders, but if I was in a town where there were people who were in militia groups, I would be meeting with them. See, engagement is not endorsement. Because you meet another person does not necessarily mean you're endorsing their worldview because you're engaged with them. But I'd be asking, tell me your narrative. What shaped you? Where did your racism come from? Was it an aunt, uncle, church? I mean, Philip Yancey, the well-known evangelical writer, says he's a recovering legalist. He grew up in a white, racist, fundamentalist church in Georgia. He says, I'm still scarred because of what happened to me as a kid. So how do we create spaces for what we call uncomfortable conversations. Because if not, my concern is that America's avoiding some of these difficult conversations at the moment. And if you look at our space in the Irish context, we avoided them too. Sadly, when things went wrong, they did go wrong. So our society was rife with sectarianism, with people discriminated against because of education, employability, and housing. And when that civil rights movement didn't work, political violence spilled on the streets. So I would encourage you to continue what you're doing, painful and difficult as it may be. Right.
Michael Musso, professor here at UCI. Thanks for your talk. Very interesting. You put a lot of stress on the role of the process of the negotiation and on the leadership, talking about Gary Adams. But I'm curious as to what you think, because you obviously have so much experience right there on the ground. How much of the process of change, you talked about the leaders taking the followers along, taking the people along. How much was there, might be the reverse, that it's the people taking the leaders along, that there's a change in the way that people are thinking. And I think there's a relevance here, because if it's the people that are changing, then does that apply to the ongoing, of course, situation in the Middle East? And if it's a matter of people changing the leadership?
Well, Max, a great question. Actually, one thing I didn't mention there, which you should have, I did sort of two projects there, one from 92 to 99. It was called Forespring, and then from 99, it was probably about $1.5 million. But from 99 to 2014, I did a project called Skenos, which was a $30 million project. It was what I call a post-conflict shared space urban village. And interestingly, the International Fund for Ireland, which primarily most of the money actually came from the United States, they put $1 billion into our peace process. Europe put €1 billion into it. And just last December 2020, through your Congress, went the Middle East Peace Fund, which is actually modelled on the International Fund for Ireland. And I know people like Tony Blair and other people have said that that was actually key in developing grassroots peace building. I think, Mike, and I'll give you exact figures for this. So I think statistically at the moment, dollar per head of person living in Israel and Palestine is like, say, $14 is going into peace building. During our conflict, I think it was between $70 to $80. So that financial investment was absolutely crucial as well. But it's also to say it's not just about economics. Because I know in some of the research that all of us in this room are involved in this have done. I mean, at the end of the day, with the whole Egyptian debate, David, you know this, they said, we'll not give up 1 grain of the Sinai Desert until we get it back, no matter what economic package you offer us at the end of the day. So it's that kind of economics are obviously important in bedding down peace processes, but the whole question of the person's land and identity is also there as well. It was interesting, I had a couple of people in from Iraq, politicians, Mike, I'm guessing it must be 4 or 5 years ago now. We finished off at Maynooth University, just south of Dublin, and I asked them, what's the thing you've learned most? And that's what they said. They said, Gary, the role of civic society. So we actually don't have a civic society in Iraq the way you would have here, strong women's groups and religious leaders coming into that space, academics doing that, and within that Irish context, that grassroots. I suppose the way actually that IFI funding worked in the 90s, primarily anyone that asked for a God, because I think their analogy was they were breaking up the heart and soil of sectarianism, but I think, as you say, also giving hope that maybe, just maybe, we'll get this over the line. I suppose as John Hume said that, I am hoping that this will finally remove the gun from Irish politics. And I'm still, despite the Brexit and the mess, I'm still reasonably optimistic that it will hold, despite some of the difficulties there. Hi.
Forgive me if this was already talked about when I stepped out, but I was living in Dublin for several years during Brexit as well, and I still have friends and family over there. And one of the things that is talked a lot about is the border, I remember family telling me, wait hours at the border to cross in and out, in the early 90s. And that's something that, especially in the Republic, they're concerned about as well. What is your take on, and will there be a hard border? And the IRA has been said that a hard border goes into place, they do an occupation after war or whatever.
There's 3 or 4 possibilities around that. The reason why the hard border didn't happen is because Lou Varadkar, who was the Irish Taoiseach or Prime Minister, that was his concern. So the other twist then was the border down the Irish Sea, which meant goods from GB coming into Northern Ireland had to be checked. So obviously, Unionists then went ballistic in relation to that. These are goods coming from GB into part of Britain, and you're actually having to check them as if we were a different country. Article 16, not to bore you, but Article 16 is this trigger mechanism which could scuttle the whole arrangements between the EU and the UK for Brexit. Now, I know through speaking to someone from the Irish government a couple of days ago, it was almost triggered in Friday. And it hasn't been for a number of kind of political channels, so stop that. If it does trigger, the other scenario that could spill out, and I think unionists need to be aware of this, is if you end up with a hard border on the island of Ireland, the IRA may say, no need to go back to balance, because Europe, and I think also the United States administration, will be pushing an agreed island even harder if that actually happens. So something that some people within the unionist tradition, which I grew up in, I know it pretty well, they assume if we get that border back up, all will be well. All may not be well, because it'll actually backfire in relation to that. I'm a Remainer. I say that unashamedly, with my wife Joyce and I, and all our kids voted to remain within the EU. And you're talking about successful peace projects. The European Union, despite its cumbersome bureaucracy, has probably been the most successful peace project of the last 100 years. There has not been a significant war in Europe, apart from Yugoslavia, Balkans, in the last 100 years, where that has allowed countries who have hated each other for centuries to come together in a joint project. Yeah, but no, the point you make is valid. And as I say, the key to that Good Friday Agreement was you would know you're passing through the border and just went up and down. I think the statistic is 500 trucks, as you call them here, or lorries as we call them, cross that border every single day. And there are no checks and balances at all. But it's that identity. We were just talking about that last night, David and I. It's that question of identity and interests. Most of us in this room want to live in a market economy. We want to live in a liberal democracy. So most of us are people of interests. It's not minimizing your American identity or my British or Irish identity, but it's not the totality of my life. But for some people it is. And particularly people who are marginalized, identity becomes the totality of life. So you remove one aspect of my identity and all hell breaks loose.
I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Dr. Mason for talking to us today.